On a humid afternoon in Saigon in 1975, as North Vietnamese forces tightened their grip around the South Vietnamese capital, an American diplomatic security officer stood in a corridor of the embassy, clutching an ordinary-looking leather briefcase. Inside the briefcase, beneath a thin layer of legitimate documents, sat enough thermite and white phosphorus to incinerate every piece of paper within a 15-foot radius in less time than it takes to draw 3 breaths. The officer's hands, trained through countless drills to remain steady under pressure, showed the faintest tremor as he monitored the radio traffic describing the collapse of South Vietnamese defenses at the city's perimeter. The briefcase bomb, as it was known within the classified world of diplomatic security, represented the final guarantee that the most sensitive intelligence documents, lists of sources, operational plans, cryptographic materials, would never fall into enemy hands. But like so many innovations in the shadowy world of Cold War intelligence, the path that led to this moment of crisis began not with any dramatic flash of inspiration, but with the slow accumulation of painful lessons learned from failures that cost lives and compromised operations across decades of conflict. The problem that the briefcase bomb was designed to solve had plagued American intelligence and diplomatic operations since the earliest days of the Cold War. Embassies and diplomatic facilities, by their nature, accumulated vast quantities of sensitive material: intelligence reports, lists of local agents and sources, communications intercepts, operational plans, assessments of host government capabilities and intentions. All of this material was supposed to be protected by diplomatic immunity and the physical security of embassy buildings, but the Cold War had demonstrated repeatedly that these protections were far from absolute. Embassy takeovers, whether by hostile governments or revolutionary movements, happened with alarming frequency. When they did, the defenders faced an impossible choice: defend classified material to the last, potentially sacrificing lives for the sake of papers, or destroy the material quickly enough to prevent capture, which often meant using methods so crude and unreliable that much would survive intact. The historical precedents weighed heavily on the minds of those tasked with diplomatic security. In 1949, when communist forces swept through China, American diplomatic personnel in several cities had attempted to burn classified documents as evacuation became imminent. The attempts were largely unsuccessful. Office workers discovered that burning large quantities of paper and standard office equipment was far slower than anyone had anticipated. Documents burned from the edges inward, leaving centers intact. Thick stacks of papers smoldered rather than burning, producing smoke that attracted attention and incomplete destruction that left sensitive material recoverable. In Shanghai, communist forces overran the consulate before destruction was complete, capturing filing cabinets full of partially burned documents that could be reconstructed by patient intelligence analysts. The Korean War provided additional painful lessons. When North Korean forces drove south in June 1950, American facilities in Seoul had almost no time to prepare for evacuation. The hasty attempts at document destruction left behind materials that compromised sources and revealed intelligence collection methods. In some cases, personnel resorted to simply throwing documents into the Han River, where many washed ashore and were recovered intact. The Army's after-action analysis of what went wrong in Seoul devoted considerable attention to the inadequacy of document destruction capabilities, but developing effective solutions proved far more difficult than identifying the problem. The fundamental challenge was one of physics and chemistry, combined with operational requirements that often seemed contradictory. Any effective method of destroying documents had to work extremely quickly, since warnings of embassy overruns or takeovers typically came with little advance notice. The destruction had to be complete and irreversible, since even partially burned documents could often be reconstructed by skilled analysts with time and patience. The method had to work reliably under stress, when personnel might be panicked or injured or operating in damaged facilities. and critically, it had to be safe enough to deploy in occupied office buildings without creating unacceptable risks to personnel or causing catastrophic fires that would spread beyond the intended target area. The CIA's Office of Technical Service, which had responsibility for developing specialized equipment for intelligence operations, began serious research into rapid document destruction methods in the early 1950s. The initial approaches were mostly variations on conventional burning, using specially designed incinerators that could handle large volumes of paper quickly. These proved marginally better than office burning, but still too slow for crisis situations. A typical embassy might have thousands of pages of classified material spread across multiple offices and safes. Gathering all of it into incinerators and achieving complete destruction could take hours, even under ideal conditions, time that would not be available when hostile forces were literally at the gates. The breakthrough came from studying military applications of thermite, an incendiary composition that had been used in welding and in certain types of bombs since World War I. Thermite consists of a metal powder, typically aluminum, mixed with a metal oxide, typically iron oxide. When ignited, thermite undergoes an exothermic reduction-oxidation reaction that produces temperatures exceeding 2200 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt through steel and certainly hot enough to incinerate paper almost instantaneously. Military forces had long used thermite for destroying equipment that could not be evacuated, and the same principle could theoretically be applied to document destruction. But adapting thermite for use in diplomatic facilities presented enormous technical challenges. Thermite reactions were violent, producing not just extreme heat, but also molten iron in significant quantities of smoke and gas. The reaction was difficult to control once initiated, continuing until all thermite was consumed, regardless of any attempts to extinguish it. Using thermite in occupied office buildings risked turning the destruction of classified documents into a catastrophe that killed the very people it was meant to protect. The challenge facing the OTS engineers was to harness thermite's destructive power while containing it sufficiently to allow safe use indoors. The solution they developed involved careful engineering of both the thermite composition and the containment system. The thermite itself was modified from military specifications, adjusting the particle size in mixture ratio to optimize for paper destruction rather than metal penetration. The reaction still produced extreme temperatures, but the heat was more evenly distributed rather than concentrated in a narrow stream as in welding thermite. The mixture was loaded into specially designed containers that would direct the thermal energy downward into the target material while containing the reaction products as much as possible. The early prototypes were tested extensively at secure facilities where engineers could evaluate their effectiveness and safety under controlled conditions. They built mock embassy offices, complete with filing cabinets, desks, and representative quantities of documents, then tested various configurations of thermite charges. High-speed cameras captured the progression of the reactions, showing how heat propagated through stacks of paper, how quickly different types of documents were consumed, whether any readable fragments survived. The tests revealed that complete document destruction required not just extreme heat, but also sustained exposure, since thick stacks of paper insulated their interiors even against thermite temperatures. The testing also revealed the significant hazards involved in indoor thermite use. The reactions produced enormous quantities of smoke and toxic gases, including carbon monoxide from the burning paper and various metal oxides from the thermite itself. The heat was sufficient to ignite surrounding materials, potentially causing fires that would spread beyond the intended target area. Early tests in enclosed spaces showed that without proper ventilation, the smoke and gases would quickly reach levels that were immediately dangerous to personnel. These findings forced the engineers to balance competing requirements. The destruction had to be quick and complete, but it also had to allow personnel time to evacuate and had to avoid creating secondary disasters. The briefcase bomb design that emerged from this research represented a compromise between ideal effectiveness and practical usability. The device consisted of a modified hard-sided briefcase, usually made of metal or heavy-duty plastic, with a thermite charge mounted in the base beneath a false bottom. Above this sat a space large enough to hold several hundred pages of documents, not enough for an entire embassy's worth of classified material, but sufficient for the most critical items that absolutely could not be allowed to fall into enemy hands. The thermite charge was designed to direct its thermal energy upward into this document compartment, while the briefcase structure contained the reaction as much as possible. The initiation system was the component that required the most sophisticated engineering. It had to be completely reliable, capable of functioning even if the briefcase had been dropped, jostled, or exposed to environmental extremes. It had to prevent accidental activation, since an unintended thermite reaction would be catastrophic, and critically, it had to allow for immediate activation in a crisis while also incorporating delays that would give personnel time to escape the immediate area. The solution involved multiple redundant systems, a mechanical safety that had to be deliberately released, an electronic arming circuit that required a specific sequence of actions, and a timer that could be set for immediate activation or for delays ranging from 30 seconds to several minutes. The activation sequence that operators were trained to use reflected lessons learned from psychological research on human behavior under stress. When people are panicked or under fire, they revert to simple, well-practiced actions and struggle with complex procedures requiring multiple steps in a specific order. The briefcase bomb activation was designed to be simple enough to execute reliably under the worst conditions. Release the mechanical safety, enter a 4-digit code on a keypad, press and hold the arming button for 3 seconds, set the timer, and withdraw. The entire process could be completed in less than 15 seconds by a trained operator, even while under fire or dealing with injuries. The timer mechanism deserves particular attention, as it represented one of the most critical safety features of the entire system. Setting the timer to immediate activation, essentially zero delay, was possible, but required a separate override procedure to prevent accidental selection. The standard timer settings were 30 seconds, 60 seconds, or 2 minutes, giving personnel time to place the briefcase in the optimal location for destroying the target documents, activate it, and evacuate to a safe distance. The 2-minute setting was considered the standard for most scenarios, providing enough time for even injured or mobility-impaired personnel to reach safety, while still being short enough that hostile forces were unlikely to reach and disable the device before activation. The thermite charge itself was sized to produce approximately 3 seconds of extreme thermal output when activated. This might seem impossibly brief for complete document destruction, but the temperatures involved, exceeding 2200 degrees Celsius, were sufficient to incinerate paper almost instantaneously on contact. The 3-second duration represented the time needed for the thermite reaction to propagate through the entire charge, during which the temperature in the document compartment would remain high enough for complete destruction. By the time the 3 seconds elapsed, everything paper-based in the briefcase would be reduced to fine ash, and most of that ash would have been consumed or scattered by the violence of the reaction. The testing regime for the briefcase bombs was extraordinarily rigorous. Each production unit was tested non-destructively to verify that all electrical systems functioned correctly, that safeties engaged and disengaged properly, that the timer was accurate. Then, a sample from each production batch was tested destructively, loaded with representative documents, and activated to verify complete destruction. These destructive tests were filmed and analyzed frame by frame to ensure that no readable fragments survived. The acceptance criteria were absolute. If even a single word remained legible after activation, the entire batch was rejected, and the manufacturing process was examined for defects. Beyond the technical testing, the briefcase bombs underwent extensive operational testing to verify they could be used effectively in realistic scenarios. CIA officers and diplomatic security personnel participated in exercises where they had to activate the devices under various simulated crisis conditions, while under simulated fire, while dealing with simulated casualties, in smoke-filled rooms, in darkness, while using only one hand due to simulated injury. These exercises revealed that even well-designed systems could fail in unpredictable ways when used by stressed personnel under challenging conditions. The training that accompanied deployment of the briefcase bombs emphasized repetitive practice until activation became automatic, a muscle memory response that would function even when higher cognitive functions were impaired by stress. The deployment of briefcase bombs to diplomatic facilities worldwide began in the late 1950s and expanded throughout the 1960s as Cold War tensions increased and the threat environment became more complex. Not every embassy received them. The devices were allocated based on threat assessments that considered the stability of the host government, the presence of hostile intelligence services, the sensitivity of operations conducted from that facility, and the likelihood of civil unrest or conflict. Embassies in Western Europe, considered relatively secure, generally did not receive briefcase bombs. Embassies in Southeast Asia, Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East, regions where coups, revolutions, and conflicts were more common, were prioritized for deployment. The actual number of briefcase bombs manufactured and deployed remains classified, but former intelligence officers have suggested that by the early 1970s, several hundred were in service worldwide. Each device had a service life of approximately 5 years, after which it had to be returned for inspection and refurbishment. The thermite charges themselves were stable and could remain viable for decades, but the electronic components, particularly the timer circuits and the batteries that maintained them, degraded over time and required replacement. The logistics of this maintenance cycle required a dedicated support organization within the CIA's Technical Services Division, with personnel responsible for tracking each device, scheduling returns and refurbishments, and ensuring that facilities always had operational units available. The security surrounding the briefcase bombs was necessarily complex. On one hand, their existence could not be completely secret, since they had to be deployed to diplomatic facilities where numerous personnel would be aware of them. On the other hand, the specific technical details, the size of the thermite charge, the design of the containment system, the exact activation procedures, had to remain highly classified to prevent hostile intelligence services from developing countermeasures. The solution was a multi-tiered classification system, where the existence of rapid document destruction capabilities was acknowledged at a relatively low classification level, but the technical specifications and operational procedures were compartmented at the highest levels. Personnel training for the briefcase bombs reflected this security model. All diplomatic security officers and designated CIA personnel at facilities that received the devices underwent basic familiarization training that explained their purpose and general operation. But detailed technical training and the authority to actually activate the devices was limited to a much smaller group, typically including the senior security officer, the station chief or chief of mission, and 1 or 2 designated alternates. These individuals underwent extensive training that included not just the mechanics of activation, but also the decision-making framework for when activation was appropriate, since the use of thermite in an occupied building was inherently dangerous and represented an action of last resort. The decision criteria for activating a briefcase bomb emphasized that it should only be used when several conditions were simultaneously met. Hostile forces were imminently about to overrun the facility, conventional document destruction methods had failed or were insufficient, the documents at risk were of such sensitivity that their capture would cause grave damage to intelligence operations or endanger lives, and personnel had been or could be evacuated from the immediate danger zone. These criteria were deliberately conservative, reflecting the understanding that using thermite in an occupied building always carried risks, and that less dangerous alternatives should always be attempted first. The operational history of the briefcase bombs includes several near uses where devices were prepared for activation but ultimately not employed, as well as at least 3 confirmed cases where they were activated in actual crisis situations. The near uses provide valuable insights into the circumstances that brought these devices to the brink of use, and the decision-making processes that occurred in those moments of extreme stress. During the 1967 Six-Day War, the CIA station in Cairo prepared briefcase bombs for potential use as anti-American riots threatened the embassy compound. The station had been maintaining contact with sources throughout the Egyptian government and military, and the loss of those source lists would have been catastrophic for American intelligence collection in the Middle East. As rioters breached the outer perimeter of the embassy compound, the station chief ordered classified materials consolidated and briefcase bombs armed. The devices sat, with timers set, waiting only for the final activation command as Egyptian security forces battled to regain control of the situation. The crisis was ultimately resolved without the bombs being triggered, but the proximity to actual use prompted a comprehensive review of document destruction protocols and led to improvements in how embassies prepared for rapid evacuation scenarios. The 1968 Tet Offensive in Vietnam produced multiple situations where briefcase bombs were armed and prepared for use. In several provincial capitals where American advisors were stationed, the sudden appearance of Viet Cong forces inside supposedly secure areas created moments of panic when it appeared that facilities would be overrun. In at least one case in Hue, a briefcase bomb was armed and positioned, with the timer set for 2 minutes, before a counterattack by South Vietnamese forces drove back the attackers, and the device was safed without activation. The close call highlighted the difficulty of making such decisions in fluid combat situations, where the tactical picture changed minute by minute. The first confirmed operational use of a briefcase bomb occurred during the evacuation of the CIA station in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, in April 1975. As Khmer Rouge forces closed in on the capital, the decision was made to evacuate all American personnel by helicopter. The station chief, following established protocols, consolidated the most sensitive documents, primarily lists of Cambodian sources who had provided intelligence and who would face certain execution if identified, into 2 briefcase bombs. Rather than risk these documents surviving conventional destruction methods or being captured during a chaotic evacuation, he activated both devices with 2-minute delays, placed them in the secure communications room, and evacuated with the last helicopter lift. The devices functioned as designed, completely destroying their contents along with additional documents that had been stacked around them. The destruction was so complete that when Khmer Rouge forces entered the facility several hours later, they found only scorched metal and fine ash where the communications center had been. The Saigon evacuation 3 weeks later involved the most extensive use of briefcase bombs of any single event. As North Vietnamese forces approached the capital and it became clear that the fall of South Vietnam was imminent, the CIA station in Saigon faced the enormous challenge of destroying vast quantities of classified material before evacuation. The station had maintained extensive operations throughout South Vietnam, recruiting sources throughout the government, military, and civilian population. The files documenting these operations filled multiple rooms. The CIA station chief in Saigon, Thomas Polgar, organized a systematic approach to document destruction that combined multiple methods. Conventional burning was used for the bulk of less sensitive material, with documents being fed continuously into specially installed incinerators. Shredders handled another portion, though concerns about reconstruction limited their use to lower classification materials. For the most critical documents, the master list of all sources and their identifying information, operational plans for stay-behind networks, cryptographic materials, and assessments of North Vietnamese capabilities, briefcase bombs provided the final guarantee of complete destruction. The activation of multiple briefcase bombs in rapid succession created conditions that tested the limits of what the devices had been designed to handle. The intense heat and smoke from the thermite reactions, combined with the smoke from conventional burning, created a toxic atmosphere throughout the top floors of the embassy building. Personnel wearing respirators could remain in the area only briefly before having to evacuate for fresh air. The thermite reactions set off fire alarms and sprinkler systems, though the water had no effect on the reactions already in progress. The violence of the multiple thermite reactions occurring nearly simultaneously caused structural damage to parts of the building, cracking concrete and warping steel beams. Despite these intense conditions, the briefcase bombs achieved their intended purpose. When North Vietnamese forces entered the CIA station spaces several days later, they found extensive evidence of document destruction, but recovered almost nothing of intelligence value from the areas where briefcase bombs had been used. The source lists that would have endangered hundreds of Vietnamese who had cooperated with American intelligence were completely destroyed, as were the operational plans and cryptographic materials. The completeness of the destruction was later confirmed through intelligence reporting on North Vietnamese efforts to reconstruct American intelligence operations, which showed that they had been unable to identify most sources or understand the full scope of what the CIA had been doing. The operational success of the briefcase bombs in Saigon came at a cost that prompted immediate reassessment of the devices and their proper employment. Several embassy personnel suffered smoke inhalation during the evacuation, serious enough to require medical treatment. The structural damage to the building, while not causing collapse, raised questions about whether the cumulative effects of multiple thermite reactions in close proximity had been adequately considered in the original engineering. And the sheer violence of the destruction process, witnessed by personnel who found the experience deeply traumatic, led to discussions about whether the devices should be modified to be less dramatic in their effects while still achieving complete document destruction. The technical lessons learned from the Saigon evacuation led to the development of an improved second-generation briefcase bomb in the late 1970s. The new design incorporated better smoke suppression through chemical additives to the thermite mixture that produced less visible smoke while maintaining thermal output. The containment system was reinforced to reduce structural damage to the surrounding building. The timer options were expanded to include a dead man switch mode, where the device would activate automatically if not disarmed within a set period, providing a failsafe if the operator was killed or incapacitated before completing activation. And the document capacity was increased by approximately 30% through more efficient internal layout. The improved design also addressed concerns about electromagnetic pulse effects and radio frequency interference. The original briefcase bombs used relatively simple electronic circuits that, while reliable, could potentially be disrupted by powerful electromagnetic fields. This vulnerability became a concern as it was recognized that hostile forces might attempt to disable electronic destruction devices by flooding an area with electromagnetic interference. The second-generation devices incorporated hardened electronics with better shielding and backup mechanical systems that could function even if all electronics were disabled. The evolution of document security technology in the 1980s raised questions about whether briefcase bombs remained necessary. Computer systems were increasingly replacing paper for classified material storage, and electronic destruction methods, overwriting hard drives, degaussing magnetic media, physically destroying storage devices, offered alternatives to thermite. But analysis by security specialists concluded that briefcase bombs remained relevant for several reasons. First, paper documents had not disappeared and were unlikely to completely disappear. Human sources still had to be documented, and much of that documentation remained on paper for security reasons. Second, electronic destruction methods required time and access to specialized equipment, advantages that might not be available in a crisis. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the psychological impact of having an absolute final backstop, a device that could guarantee destruction regardless of circumstances, provided reassurance that influenced how personnel approached document security more broadly. The end of the Cold War did not end the need for rapid document destruction capabilities in diplomatic facilities. If anything, the proliferation of regional conflicts, the rise of international terrorism, and the increasing sophistication of hostile intelligence services made document security more challenging. The 1990s saw attacks on American embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. The seizure of the American embassy in Tehran during the Iranian Revolution remained a cautionary tale of what could happen when document destruction failed, and various regional conflicts continued to create situations where American diplomatic facilities faced potential overrun. The briefcase bombs were deployed to embassies in Baghdad during both Gulf Wars, to facilities in the former Yugoslavia during the Balkans conflicts, to embassies in various African nations experiencing civil wars or coups, and to diplomatic facilities in several Middle Eastern countries following the September 11 attacks. In each case, the presence of these devices represented a final guarantee that the most sensitive intelligence material would not fall into hostile hands, even if every other security measure failed. The training evolution for briefcase bombs reflected broader changes in how diplomatic security personnel were prepared for crisis situations. Early training had focused primarily on the mechanical operation of the devices, assuming that the decision to use them would be made by senior officials and that operators would simply execute that decision. By the 1990s, training had expanded to include extensive scenario-based exercises, where participants had to make the decision themselves whether to activate devices under various ambiguous circumstances. These exercises revealed that making such decisions under stress was far more difficult than simply following orders, and that personnel needed extensive preparation to make sound judgments when lives and intelligence operations hung in the balance. Modern variations of the briefcase bomb concept have evolved to address contemporary security challenges. Some versions are designed specifically for electronic media destruction, using thermite to physically destroy hard drives, solid-state storage, and other electronic devices. Others are optimized for chemical document destruction, using reactive compounds that break down paper and ink into unrecoverable sludge without the extreme heat and smoke of thermite. But the core concept remains: a portable, rapidly activated system that guarantees complete and irreversible destruction of sensitive material when all other options have failed. The existence of briefcase bombs and similar destruction devices represents a particular intersection of technology, psychology, and operational necessity. They exist because the consequence of failure, the compromise of sources, the exposure of operations, the endangerment of lives, is simply unacceptable. They must be reliable enough to function under the worst imaginable conditions, safe enough to deploy in occupied buildings without creating unacceptable risks, and effective enough to guarantee complete destruction. Meeting all these requirements simultaneously required sustained engineering effort over decades and continues to require ongoing refinement as threat environments evolve and technology advances. The legacy of the briefcase bomb extends beyond its specific technical achievements to influence how intelligence services think about security in general. It demonstrates the principle that effective security requires defense in depth, with multiple layers of protection that each provide some degree of safeguard. Document classification, physical security, encryption, access controls, all of these measures are important, but none are absolute. The briefcase bomb represents the final layer, the one that ensures that even if every other protection fails, the most critical secrets remain secure. The officers who developed, tested, refined, and deployed the briefcase bomb never received public recognition for their work during their careers, operating as they did in the classified world of intelligence technology. But within the intelligence community, the briefcase bomb became a symbol of the technical services' commitment to providing operators with tools that worked when lives and operations depended on them. It represented engineering excellence in service of intelligence operations, the application of scientific principles to solve practical problems that had no easy solutions. The briefcase bomb stands now as a historical artifact of Cold War intelligence, displayed in a few museums where the public can see the device that played such a crucial role in protecting American intelligence operations for decades. But its descendants remain in service today in forms that remain classified but that serve the same essential purpose, guaranteeing that when American intelligence personnel must abandon a facility under threat, the secrets that could cost lives and compromise operations will be destroyed completely and irreversibly in seconds rather than hours by devices that have been engineered and tested to work reliably under the worst possible conditions. In this sense, the legacy of the briefcase bomb continues, a testament to the enduring principle that intelligence work requires not just sophisticated collection capabilities, but also sophisticated means of ensuring that what is collected remains protected, even in circumstances that would seem to make protection impossible.